Welcome to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going chapter by chapter through the whole Bible, Genesis to Revelation, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. Today, we're on Genesis chapter 31, and we see Jacob leave Laban's home to finally go back to the Promised Land. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into our summary of Genesis chapter 31. In this chapter, it starts off with Laban beginning to despise Jacob because Jacob had taken all his sheep. Now, what it means by taking all his sheep, we saw in the last chapter that they had come to a deal that Jacob would take all the spotted sheep and Laban would keep all the solid color sheep, and that would be the wages for Jacob to stay for a little bit longer and watch Laban's flock. The Lord then shows up and tells Jacob it's time to go back to the Promised Land. And he promises to be with Jacob in those travels. So Jacob then calls Rachel and Leah to him, and he explains to both of them what has happened, what God has said. He explains to them that God is the one who caused all the sheep to be born speckled to give them to Jacob. So then Jacob takes his wives and his children and he leaves in secret. He tries to sneak out. Laban and Jacob apparently didn't live right next to each other or didn't see each other every day. So Laban doesn't find out Jacob's gone until about 3 days later. So then he leaves in secret. Rachel, on the way out, steals Laban's idols. So Laban was an idol worshiper. He had multiple idols, and Rachel steals them as they leave. Laban chases Jacob once he finds out that Jacob has fled. Laban chases Jacob with the intention of harming him, but God shows up to Laban and speaks to him in a dream and tells him not to harm Jacob. So once Laban catches up to Jacob, Laban looks for his idols, but Rachel hides them. Jacob and Laban then end up making a treaty together, and then they depart and they never see each other again. And that's how the chapter ends. So some key takeaways from this chapter. So 20 years after Jacob was sidetracked from the land of Canaan and the promise, God told him to return to the Promised Land. Jacob worked for Laban for 20 years, 14 for Leah and Rachel, and another additional 6 years watching his flock. It's been a long time. And remember, he was sidetracked from the land of Canaan because he had fled from Esau after tricking his father into giving him the blessing, and Esau wanted to kill him. So this has been a long time sidetracked from God's plans and God's purposes, and yet God speaks to him and says, it's time. You need to go back to the land that I promised you. God references in this dream that he has, God references the place of Jacob's first encounter with the Lord, Bethel. It's where Jacob fell asleep and had the dream of the ladder and angels ascending and descending. And God references that, which is very important. It's like God is saying, look, you've been sidetracked, but I'm going to call you back to that place of encounter, back to that place, that first place where I first encountered you. We see this throughout Scripture. We see God doing this where he'll say, go back to your first love, go back to your first works, go back to the place where you had initially encountered God. Sometimes we get sidetracked and God calls us back to that place of encounter. Very, very important. God promises that he would be with Jacob, yet Jacob fled in secret. He acted in fear rather than telling his father-in-law that he was leaving. Now, God has already promised that God was going to be with Jacob. God already promised that safe passage back to the Promised Land. God already made the promise, and yet Jacob is afraid and doesn't trust God. So he's going to obey God, but still wrestles with that fear, which is very important. So he obeyed God, but he's still wrestling with doubt and lack of trust. Again, God doesn't use perfect people. He calls and uses people who are willing to obey even while wrestling their trust and doubt issues. Rachel ends up stealing the idols of her father in this passage. Now, this is a strange statement. It's a strange story that gets thrown in here. We don't actually know what Rachel's motivation in stealing the idols was. There's been several theories that have been promoted suggesting why this could be. One is some people claim that she worshiped the idols and wanted them with her, that she was a idol worshiper. There's really no indication of that in the text or outside of the text that gives that indication. It appears, we see, throughout her life, it appears that once she met Jacob and Jacob explained who Yahweh was, she no longer worshipped idols, but she could have. It's a possibility. Another option is she did not want her father to inquire about them, to use them as a tools of divination to catch them. That basically she was afraid that if he had these idols, he would be able to inquire of the idols and would find out where they were, which is superstition and nonsense. Again, not really a strong evidence to support that theory. Some have suggested that they were used as deeds to property, and she thought that by taking the idols, she took whatever inheritance might be left to Laban's children. This one has some merit. There is some historical record showing that sometimes idols were used as deed to properties. And we also have in the text itself her complaining that Laban had spent all of their inheritance. So in a way, this has some possibility. This has a little bit more weight than the first two. There's also a theory that says Rachel stole the idols to get back at Laban. Again, some textual context for this. It mentions the stealing of the idols as she complains about her father not saving an inheritance for them or doing nothing for Rachel and Leah. So in a way, that's a possibility. There is some textual evidence for that one. And then there are some Jewish traditions that say that she stole the idols because she didn't want her father being an idolater, that she had turned to the real God and she wanted her father to do so as well. So she stole the idols. Those are the primary theories for why she would have stole the idols. From Haran, which is where Laban was, to the mountains of Gilead, which is where God told them to go or told them to head, and it's where Laban catches up to Jacob. From Haran to the mountains of Gilead is about 300 miles. So Laban actually pursued Jacob for 300 miles. Obviously, he was committed. Now, what's interesting is that God did not show up and speak to Laban until he called up to Jacob in the mountains of Gilead. He could have showed up to Laban well before that. He could have showed up to Laban before Laban even left Haran, but he didn't. He waited until Laban already made it to the mountains of Gilead. Then he showed up. The covenant or treaty between Jacob and Laban was not made out of kindness, contrary to how Laban tries to make it sound when he speaks to Jacob. Laban does not trust Jacob. And so he says several things within this treaty. He says, if you afflict my daughters or marry other women, basically God's going to see it and I will kill you. They also set up a barrier and said that they would basically stay on each other's side, that Jacob would stay on his side, Laban would stay on his side. And if they crossed that barrier, the treaty would in essence be broken. And basically Laban is saying, I'm going to kill you. If you come back across this pillar that we're setting up, I'll kill you. So God kind of warned Laban not to kill Jacob. And so he doesn't, but he's saying, look, we're going to set up a treaty, but if you break it, I'll kill you. But again, it was not made out of kindness. So this tells us 5 things about God. Number 1, God guides us. God guided Jacob. God told Jacob that it was time to go. God guided Jacob in what to do with the sheep. God brought guidance. 2, he protects us. God protects. God protected Jacob by sending the dream to Laban to keep Laban from killing him. God protects us. 3, God moves in his timing. God protected Jacob, but he didn't stop Jacob from being pursued. He only stopped Jacob from being killed at the last moment when God shows up to Laban. God moves in his timing. Number 4, we see it over and over, chapter after chapter. God is merciful. Laban, Rachel, everybody committing sins, everybody doing wrong things, yet God is still merciful. And finally, God is present. God promises that his presence would be with Jacob, that he would go with Jacob. God is with you. 5 things we learned about God. I hope you take this, dig a little deeper in the chapter, seek after the presence of God while you study this. I'll see you next time.